The evolution of harnessing sunlight. The first time humanity stole fire from the sky, the sun has always been both a giver and a threat, long before electricity, before engines, before nations were built on grids of energy. Humanity lived under a sky ruled by one absolute power, the sun. It dictated harvests, migrations, wars, and survival itself. To early humans, it was not a star. It was a god that watched everything, and yet, deep inside that fear, something else existed: curiosity. The first spark of defiance did not come from a laboratory or a civilization known for science. It came from observation, simple, dangerous, and almost accidental. Ancient humans noticed something strange. Shiny stones could reflect sunlight, water surfaces could redirect it, and polished metal, when angled correctly, could do something extraordinary. It could bend light itself. At first, it was nothing more than play, a reflection on a cave wall, a flicker of brightness on stone. But across generations, this play evolved into knowledge, and in that knowledge, humanity found its first weapon against sunlight. The myth that became science. In ancient Mediterranean civilizations, stories were told of warriors who could summon the power of the sun itself. One of the most famous legends came from the siege of Syracuse, where the inventor Archimedes was said to have used polished bronze mirrors to concentrate sunlight onto enemy ships, setting them ablaze. Historians still debate whether it truly happened, but what matters more than truth is belief, because that belief revealed something profound. Humans had realized that sunlight could be controlled, not worshipped, not feared, controlled. That idea, once planted, would never die. The forgotten science of light. While myths shaped imagination, real scientific understanding was slowly forming in parallel. Centuries later, scholars began studying light not as magic, but as physics. They discovered reflection, refraction, angles, focus points, invisible rules governing something that once seemed divine. But even then, no one could use sunlight in a meaningful way. They could only observe it, and observation, no matter how precise, was not yet power. America enters the story. Light becomes industry. Fast forward thousands of years. The world has changed. Empires have risen and fallen. Steam has replaced horses. Electricity has replaced gas lamps. And the United States of America has become a rising industrial force driven by machines, steel, and ambition. But even in the age of factories and coal, sunlight remained untamed. For most of American history, the sun was still just a background force useful for agriculture, ignored by industry. That would not last, because somewhere in the 19th century, a quiet revolution began. Scientists started asking a radical question. What if sunlight could be converted directly into electricity? Not heat, not fire. Electricity, a form of energy that could power cities, machines, and eventually, civilization itself. The first true breakthrough in 1839. A young French scientist named Edmond Becquerel discovered something extraordinary. When light hit certain materials, it created an electric current. It was weak, almost useless, but it was real. This was the first recorded observation of what would later become the photovoltaic effect, the scientific foundation of solar power. At the time, nobody understood its importance. It was a curiosity, a lab trick, nothing more. But history has a strange habit. It hides revolutions inside small experiments. The long silence before the storm. For nearly a century after Becquerel's discovery, nothing significant happened. The world was obsessed with coal, oil, and steam. Energy meant digging into the earth, not looking toward the sky. Factories grew louder, cities grew darker with smoke, and sunlight, the oldest energy source on earth, remained untouched as a serious power system. But science does not forget. It waits. The silicon revolution begins in the early 20th century. A new material quietly entered the stage. Silicon. At first, it was just another element in chemistry textbooks. But researchers soon discovered something unusual about it. When treated correctly, silicon could convert sunlight into electricity far more efficiently than anything before it. Then came the real turning point. In 1954, Bell Labs created the first practical silicon solar cell. It was small, expensive, inefficient, but it worked. For the first time in human history, sunlight was no longer just light. It was energy, real, usable electricity. America looks to the skies. United States quickly realized something important. Solar energy wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a strategic advantage, especially in space. Early satellites needed power sources that could work without fuel, without oxygen, without moving parts. Solar panels became the perfect solution. In orbit, far above Earth's atmosphere, sunlight became pure, uninterrupted power, and suddenly, what began as ancient mirror experiments had evolved into something unimaginable: machines powered by the sun. In space, the silent revolution on Earth. Back on Earth, however, solar power was still not mainstream. It was expensive, complicated, experimental, but the foundation had been laid, and slowly, quietly, the idea began to grow. Homes could be powered by sunlight. Cities could reduce dependency on fossil fuels. Entire nations could rethink energy. A transformation was beginning, not loud like oil, not smoky like coal, but silent like sunlight itself. What began as reflections on bronze mirrors had now become silicon technology orbiting Earth. But the real revolution was only beginning, because the moment humanity learned to capture sunlight efficiently, it would change everything forever, and the next chapter would bring space-based solar power dreams, the oil crisis that forced innovation, the rise of modern solar farms in America, and the battle between fossil fuels and the sun, the oil crisis that changed everything. The world does not change slowly. It changes suddenly in moments of panic, shortage, and fear. For decades after the invention of the silicon solar cell, oil had been king. It powered America's cars, factories, airplanes, and suburbs. Entire cities were built around it. Entire economies depended on it. Oil was not just energy, it was power, politics, and global control. And then, in the early 1970s, the system began to crack. The moment the lights started to flicker in 1973, something unthinkable happened. Oil-producing nations in the Middle East reduced supply to countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Prices exploded. Fuel shortages spread across the United States and Europe. Gas stations ran dry. Cars lined up for miles. People waited hours, sometimes overnight, just to buy fuel. For the first time in modern history, the most powerful nation on Earth felt energy insecurity. And in that moment, a terrifying realization emerged. Civilization was fragile. America faces an energy identity crisis. The United States had built its post-war prosperity on cheap, abundant oil. Highways stretched across the continent. Suburbs expanded outward. Air travel became common. The American dream itself was fueled by gasoline. But now that dream was under threat. Industries slowed. Inflation surged. Governments scrambled for solutions. And behind closed doors, a new question began to dominate scientific and political discussions. What happens if oil never becomes stable again? Because this wasn't just a temporary crisis. It was a warning. The forgotten technology returns during the chaos. Scientists and engineers began revisiting an idea that had long been ignored: solar energy. For decades, it had been dismissed as too expensive, too inefficient, too impractical. But now, everything had changed. Energy was no longer cheap. And suddenly, sunlight didn't look weak anymore. It looked infinite. The shift from theory to survival. NASA, military researchers, and American universities began investing more seriously in solar technology. Early solar panels were still expensive, but they had one undeniable advantage. They didn't depend on foreign supply chains. They didn't require drilling, shipping, or political alliances. They just needed one thing: sunlight. And in a world of uncertainty, independence became more valuable than efficiency. The industrial world begins to listen. By the late 1970s, solar technology started moving out of laboratories and into real-world testing. Small solar farms appeared. Experimental rooftops were built. Government research programs expanded. At the same time, all companies still dominated the global economy, but for the first time, Their monopoly was being questioned, not by war, not by politics, but by physics. The silent competition against battle was no longer just about energy sources. It was about the future of civilization itself. Two paths were emerging, one powered by buried carbon, extracted from the earth, and one powered by direct light from the sky. Fossil fuels represented the past, powerful, established, deeply embedded in infrastructure. Solar energy represented something else entirely. A future that did not need digging. A future that did not need burning. A future that simply needed daylight. The psychological shift in America's smithing subtle began to change in the American mindset. For the first time, people started thinking of energy not as something purchased, but something harvested. The idea was revolutionary. Roofs were no longer just shelter, they became potential power stations. Deserts were no longer empty land, they became energy fields. And sunlight, once taken for granted, became a resource. Innovation under pressure. History shows a pattern. Pressure creates innovation. The oil crisis forced governments, corporations, and scientists to rethink everything. Research funding increased. Efficiency improved. New materials were tested. Silicon technology advanced faster than ever before. And slowly, solar power began its long climb out of obscurity, not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary. A new vision of energy emerges by the end of the 1970s. A new vision was forming inside research institutions. What if energy could be decentralized? What if every home could generate its own power? What if the grid itself became distributed instead of centralized? These were not just engineering questions, they were political questions, economic questions, civilization questions, because whoever controlled energy controlled the future. The oil crisis did not destroy the energy system. It exposed it, and in that moment of weakness, solar energy stopped being a fantasy and started becoming a necessity. But the real transformation was still ahead, because in the coming decades, Silicon Valley would accelerate solar innovation. Governments would invest billions into renewable infrastructure, and solar would begin its quiet war against fossil fuels. The solar wars of modern America's world does not always fight wars with weapons. Sometimes it fights with innovation. Sometimes it fights with energy. And in modern America, a new kind of conflict began, one that would never appear on traditional battlefields, but would reshape economies, politics, and the future of civilization itself. This was the solar war, not a war of destruction, but a war of replacement. The invisible battlefield. By the late 20th century, fossil fuels still dominated global energy. Oil rigs stretched across oceans. Coal plants powered entire states. Natural gas flowed through pipelines like lifelines of industrial civilization. But beneath this established order, something new was rising. Silicon-based solar technology. It was quiet. It was clean. And at first, it was ignored. But history has a pattern. What is ignored often becomes what is inevitable. Silicon Valley enters the energy gamma in the heart of California, a region already transforming computing. Another revolution began quietly taking shape. Engineers and startups realized something profound. The same material powering microchips could also capture sunlight. Silicon was not just the foundation of computers. It was the foundation of energy transformation. As computing power increased, so did the ability to design more efficient solar cells. And for the first time in history, digital technology began accelerating physical energy innovation. The rise of industrial solar. By the early 2000s, solar panels were no longer experimental, they were industrial. Solar farms began spreading across deserts in Nevada, Arizona, and California. Gigantic fields of glass and silicon began replacing empty land with energy production systems visible from space. The United States was quietly building a second energy infrastructure, one that did not depend on fuel, transportation, or combustion. It depended only on light. The economic war begins, but every revolution disrupts something, and solar energy disrupted one of the most powerful industries in human history. Fossil fuels, oil companies, gas corporations, and coal producers had shaped global politics for over a century. Entire economies were built around them. Now, a decentralized energy model threatened that control because solar power did something dangerous. It gave energy independence to individuals. Homes could generate their own electricity, businesses could reduce dependency on grids, entire regions could become self-sufficient, and in economics, independence is disruption, policy, power, and resistance. The transition was not smooth. Governments debated subsidies, energy. Companies lobbied against rapid change, infrastructure. Systems resisted replacement because they were too expensive to abandon, and critics argued solar could never fully replace traditional energy due to storage limitations and intermittency. But progress did not stop because the economics of sunlight were undeniable. It was free. It was everywhere, and it would never run out. The breakthrough that changed everything for decades. Solar energy faced one major limitation: storage. Sunlight disappears at night. Clouds interrupt supply. Energy must be stored to be reliable. Then came the breakthrough: lithium-ion batteries. As battery technology improved, solar energy stopped being intermittent and started becoming stable. Now, energy could be captured during the day and used at night. This single advancement changed everything. America begins to transform by the 2010s. Solar was no longer a niche technology. It was becoming mainstream. Corporations installed rooftop systems, entire states expanded renewable energy targets, electric utilities began integrating solar into national grids, and a cultural shift began to emerge. Energy was no longer something extracted. It was something generated locally. This changed not just infrastructure, but identity. The electric revolution joins the battle at the same time. Another technology entered the battlefield: electric vehicles. Cars were no longer just machines of combustion. They became mobile energy systems. Electric motors, powered increasingly by solar-generated electricity, began replacing gasoline engines. Transportation and energy were merging into one system, and the implications were massive because now the oil industry was not just competing with solar, it was competing with electrification itself. The new definition of power in the solar wars. Power no longer meant only electricity. It meant control over production, storage, and distribution, and solar energy changed all three. Energy production became decentralized, storage became scalable, distribution became digital. The grid was no longer a one-way system. It became intelligent. The philosophical shift, perhaps the most important change, was not technological. It was psychological. For centuries, humanity believed energy must be taken from the earth. Now, for the first time, civilization began to understand energy could come from above. Not destruction, not extraction, but transformation. Sunlight became not just a resource, but a relationship between humanity and the universe. The solar wars were not fought with weapons. They were fought with innovation, economics, and time. And by the end of this era, one truth became unavoidable: solar energy was no longer the future. It was the present, beginning to replace the past. But the story is far from over, because what comes next is even more extraordinary. Solar grids powered by AI, global renewable energy dominance, space-based solar stations, and humanity's attempt to harvest sunlight beyond Earth. The rise of solar America. Modern era transformation. The greatest revolutions are not loud. They do not announce themselves with explosions or declarations. They arrive quietly until one day the world wakes up and realizes everything has already changed. That is exactly how solar energy rose in modern America. Not as a sudden takeover, but as a silent transformation hiding in plain sight. The tipping point be the 2010s, and into the 2020s, something fundamental had shifted. Solar energy was no longer experimental. It was no longer alternative. It was becoming competitive. And in energy history, that moment changes everything. Because once a new energy source becomes economically viable, it does not need permission to grow. It only needs time. The rooftop revolution begins across the United States. A quiet revolution started on rooftops. Homes in California, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada began installing solar panels at unprecedented rates. What once looked like futuristic technology became a normal sight in suburban neighborhoods. For the first time in American history, millions of households were no longer just consumers of electricity, they were producers. This was a fundamental shift in civilization. The grid starts to change itself. Traditional power grids were designed for one direction, central power plants, consumers, but solar energy broke that model. Now electricity could flow in multiple directions. Homes, grid, solar farms, cities, rooftops, storage systems. The grid was no longer static. It became dynamic, and with the integration of smart software systems, it began to behave almost like a living organism, balancing supply, demand, and storage in real time. The rise of smart energy as artificial intelligence advanced, it began to enter the energy sector. AI systems started predicting electricity demand, optimizing solar output, and managing storage networks across entire regions. Energy was no longer just generated. It was calculated. This marked a turning point. Electricity became data-driven, and data became the new foundation of energy management. America's deserts become power cities in places once considered empty and unused. A new kind of infrastructure emerged. The deserts of the American Southwest transformed into massive solar farms stretching across land like artificial oceans of glass. California's Mojave Desert, Nevada's open plains, and Arizona's sun-drenched landscapes became some of the most important energy-producing regions in the world. From above, these solar fields looked almost like digital landscapes, geometric, precise, and endlessly reflective. The sun was no longer just rising over America. It was being harvested. The storage breakthrough era. One of the final barriers to full solar adoption was energy storage, but in the modern era, battery technology evolved rapidly. Lithium-ion systems became cheaper, more efficient, and more scalable. Entire utility-scale storage farms began appearing next to solar fields. For the first time, energy could be captured in sunlight, stored in silence, released on demand. This solved the greatest weakness of solar power, intermittency, and pushed it into full industrial reliability. Transportation joins the revolution. Transformation did not stop at electricity. Transportation began to merge with energy systems. Electric vehicles became more common on American roads. Charging networks expanded rapidly. Cars were no longer isolated machines, they became part of a national energy ecosystem. Some even began exploring vehicle-to-grid systems, where cars could return stored electricity back into the grid during peak demand. Transportation and energy were becoming one unified system. Corporate America goes solar. One of the most significant shifts came from the private sector. Major corporations in the United States began investing heavily in solar infrastructure. Warehouses, factories, data centers, and office buildings adopted large-scale solar integration. This was not just environmental policy. It was economic strategy, because solar energy offered something powerful: predictability. In a volatile energy market and in business, predictability is profit. A cultural shift in energy thinking. Perhaps the most profound change was not technological or economic. It was cultural. For generations, energy was associated with extraction: oil rigs, coal mines, drilling platforms. Now, a new idea was forming in the American consciousness. Energy could be clean, visible, and infinite. Sunlight was no longer just weather. It was infrastructure. The first steps toward a solar civilization. As solar adoption increased, scientists and engineers began thinking beyond Earth itself. If sunlight could be captured on Earth, what about in space? Orbiting solar stations, free from clouds, weather, and night cycles, began to emerge as serious research concepts. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Harvest energy where sunlight is constant, transmitted back to Earth. This was no longer science fiction. It was engineering discussion. By the modern era, solar energy had transformed from an experimental curiosity into a core pillar of American infrastructure. It was no longer competing to survive. It was competing to lead. But the final chapter is the most ambitious of all, because humanity is now asking a question that once belonged only to imagination. What if the future of energy is not on Earth, but beyond it? The future space solar civilization and Dyson swarms. Every civilization reaches a moment when its greatest limitation is no longer knowledge, but energy. For humanity, that moment is arriving now, because on Earth, we have begun to face a ceiling not of intelligence, not of technology, but of power generation. And so, once again, humanity turns its eyes upward, not just toward the sky, but beyond it. The idea that changed everything: unlimited sunlight on Earth. Solar energy is powerful but limited. Night arrives, weather interferes, land is finite. But above Earth's atmosphere, something extraordinary exists, a constant, uninterrupted stream of solar energy. No clouds, no night, no seasons, just pure, continuous sunlight. And that realization led scientists and futurists to a radical idea. If Earth cannot capture enough energy, then space must. The first step, orbital solar stations. The concept begins with something surprisingly simple: solar satellites orbiting Earth. These massive structures would collect sunlight in space, convert it into electricity, and transmit it wirelessly back to Earth using microwave or laser systems from below. They would appear invisible, but their impact would be enormous. A single orbital solar station could potentially generate power 24 hours a day, without interruption. For the first time in human history, energy would no longer depend on Earth's cycles. It would depend on space itself. A civilization connected by light. In this future vision, Earth becomes part of a larger energy ecosystem. Solar farms on the ground work alongside orbital stations above the atmosphere. Energy flows globally, not constrained by geography, weather, or borders. Power becomes universal infrastructure, a shared resource managed across nations. And slowly, energy stops being something we compete for and becomes something we coordinate. The role of artificial intelligence. Seeming such a system would be impossible without intelligence far beyond human scale. Artificial intelligence becomes the central nervous system of the solar civilization. AI systems would predict solar output across Earth and orbit, manage global energy distribution, balance supply and demand in real time, prevent overloads, and optimize storage. Coordinate between terrestrial and space-based grid. Synergy becomes not just physical infrastructure, but a living computational network. Enter the Dyson swarm concept. But orbital solar stations are only the beginning. Far beyond Earth, a more ambitious idea emerges: the Dyson swarm. Unlike a solid structure, a Dyson swarm is a vast collection of solar collecting satellites orbiting a star, in this case, our Sun. Each unit captures a fraction of solar energy. Together, they could harvest a significant portion of the Sun's total output. This is no longer planetary engineering. This is stellar engineering. Humanity as a Type I civilization. According to the Kardashev scale, civilizations are measured by their energy usage. Type I, planetary energy. Type II, stellar energy. Type III, galactic energy. Humanity today is still transitioning toward Type I, but a Dyson swarm represents something far greater: the beginning of Type II civilization behavior. It is the moment humanity stops merely living on a planet and starts interacting with a star. The end of energy scarcity. If space-based solar systems and Dyson swarm technologies ever become reality, the implications are staggering. Energy scarcity would disappear, electricity could become effectively unlimited, water desalination, climate stabilization, and global infrastructure could be powered at unprecedented scale. Entire deserts could become green. Entire cities could become fully electrified. Entire industries could operate without fossil fuels, not because humanity solved energy efficiency, but because it finally solved energy abundance. A new kind of civilization. In this future, humanity changes fundamentally. We are no longer defined by resource limitation. We are defined by energy coordination. Cities become nodes in a planetary grid. Satellites become power plants. The Sun becomes infrastructure. and Earth becomes part of a larger system that extends into space. The final question, but every technological leap raises a deeper question. Not can we do it, but what does it make us become? A civilization powered by space-based solar energy is no longer just industrial. It is cosmic, and once humanity learns to harvest the sun at scale, the next question naturally follows. What comes after the sun? From ancient mirrors reflecting fire on bronze, to silicon panels capturing sunlight on Earth, to satellites harvesting energy in orbit, to imagine Dyson swarms surrounding the sun itself. This is the story of one idea that never stopped evolving, that light can become power, and if history is any guide, we have only just begun.